and we get into a conversation for this hour. We're leaving the shores of the country, but actually not really leaving the shores of the country. We're having a conversation then around what Kenya's positioning is when it comes to global power games. Joining us is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, Peter Zalmayev, and he joins us in the hot seat this morning. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, good morning.
How are you doing?
Fine, thank you.
Welcome to the Situation Room. You're in the hot seat of the Situation Room this morning. We're looking into a matter of issues. Of course, the Ukraine war, which has been going on for a while. We're going to then talk into issues of power plays that NATO plays, and of course, Africa's strategic dilemma, if there is one. We're looking into that this morning. As we normally do, we're going to welcome you to today's show with a proverb from one African country. We'd love to hear your interpretation of it. Dennis will tell us where we are, and then we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so today we are in Zambia, and a beautiful country comes from the southern part of the continent, and it is a country whose economy is majorly pushed by mining, especially when you talk about cobalt and copper. Agriculture, tourism, and energy are also part of the economic ventures that is pushing Zambia moving forward, and as well as it is a landlocked country, so they depend on other countries that have ports to be able to get goods that they import. But let's go straight to our proverb today. A head that consults never gets bold. A head that consults never goes bold. How would you interpret that?
The consults, I'm sorry, I didn't...
A head that consultation, never gets bold.
I'm not sure I'm following. Bored or bold?
Bold.
What does that mean? I'm sorry.
No hair.
No hair.
Look at me.
Is there some kind of a set? I'm not sure. Is it an expression? I'm not sure what the meaning of this is.
A person who consults pretty much never loses their hair.
But I'm just not sure what the question is.
It's a proverb.
It is a proverb.
I'm sorry, I'm lost, folks. In this idiomatic, can you ask me in a different way? I don't know what that means.
Okay, so Andrew, it's a proverb that comes from a country, and we would like to hear what you think about the proverb. A head that consults will never go bald.
I just don't know what the meaning of this proverb means. I'm sorry. I did travel to Zambia on my trip. This is my 15th country, and Zambia was on my itinerary a few weeks ago, and I actually was able to appeal to the people of Zambia to actually encourage their government to play a more muscular role in the negotiation process between Russia and Ukraine, and that led to a whole orgy of self-flagellation and self-abnegation on the part of Zambians. Who that was posted on the Zambian Broadcasting Corporation Facebook page and garnered about 8,000 likes and dislikes, and they were like, "This guy is a comedian talking about me," because Zambia was at that time going through this political crisis of having to bury a president, that they couldn't bury their president, who had to be buried in Pretoria. And so, but that led to this whole discussion of what Africa's role can and should be regarding the peace in Ukraine. Now, if to backtrack, and if I'm understanding correctly, when you say consultant, you mean political consultants. Yeah?
It's up to you.
It's up to you.
Because I worked as a consultant on so-called K Street in Washington, D.C., and I actually helped people, convey their messages to American senators and congressmen for many years, and as you see, I'm still not bald yet, even though I've started graying on the temples of my head. I think I finally got out of this situation. Sorry, folks, I haven't had my coffee yet this morning.
That explains a lot. But I think you're on the right track because you still have hair on your head, and you've consulted quite some, so I think you have interpreted the proverb without knowing that you've interpreted the proverb. All right. So let's get into this conversation, shall we? Because we kind of gave a precedent to it. Here we are, and we are saying, that, there's certain conversations that we have following at this hour, and it is clear that there's certain power games that are being played. The global power situation at the moment will have a lot of things to be said. We're obviously looking at Africa's strategic place in all of this. Let's come from the Ukraine war. When this started, some odd years ago, the question is, okay, so why should we bother, and what position do we play? Let's get some insights from you in terms of that.
Right. Well, the war in Ukraine started, as you know, 3.5 years ago, and of course it has not left any country unaffected. We're living, it's almost a truism, right? A banality to say that we're living in an interconnected world where, a war like this happens in a country that has been known as the breadbasket of the world since World War II, at least, right? A country that provides a bulk of the world's grain, and the fluctuation in the price of grain that ensued after this war because of the blockade of the Ukrainian seaports and the inability to transport this grain led to significant deprivation on the part of people living, especially in poor countries. Some of the ones that I visited on this trip, like Malawi, Lesotho, Mozambique, where people live under $1 a day, and that means that makes a huge difference to those people. And I was traveling, and they were telling me that, gosh, Peter, this war could not have come at a worse moment. You go straight from COVID to this war, so that has led to immiseration of whole swaths of the population, from Bangladesh to the African continent. And of course, now we're talking about the political aspect of it and the competing narratives, right, of this war. So there's like a battle for the hearts and minds of Africans of who to side with. And, as I said, my 15th country, the story is not cut and dried in the countries that I visited. Some are more supportive of Ukraine. In other countries, Russian narratives prevail, truth to be told, right? I've met a lot of sympathy on the part of regular Africans who meet me on the streets of African cities. But then, for example, whenever there's a social media post made about my appearance, my interview, etc., just looking at the commentary, right, at the comments of people commenting on what I said, I can see that Russian, narratives also are very strong throughout the continent. And part of my mission is to unpack those arguments.
What are those narratives?
Like, for example, that Ukraine is at fault. It provoked Russia by being willing to join NATO. And so there's a culpability on the part of Western countries as well, who dragged Ukraine into this, or worse, are using Ukraine to weaken Russia. So that's been the argument, and I've been having to struggle with the argument, and we can just look at it, why I don't think that really it carries any water, simply because, let's just jump ahead, and we can talk about it later, the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska. Donald Trump has essentially promised to Russia that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. So my question is, why isn't Putin wrapping up this war? I mean, you can say that he kind of was willing to meet with Trump, and he might be willing to do that. But so far, what we're seeing is the conditions being imposed on Ukraine for a peace agreement are capitulatory. Essentially, that would mean a loss of our sovereignty, disarmament of our army, a no on foreign policy choices of our own, Russian as the official language, and other things. Essentially, Ukraine would turn back into a colony of Russia, which brings me to my point that the war that Russia is leading in fighting in Ukraine against Ukraine is a neo-colonialist or neo-imperialist war of a former metropoly against a former colony to drag Ukraine back into its orbit.
Okay. What has happened as a result of this war that has and what impact has it had on the people of Ukraine? Give us an example or a few of those.
Well, first of all, let's start with the fact that when the war started, 6 to 7 million Ukrainians left Ukraine, mostly women and children. Most men of draftable age from 18 to 61 are not allowed to leave unless for a special reason. The bulk of those, up to 4 to 5 million, remain outside of Ukraine. So you think about this. It's 12% of the population, at least, if not more, depending on how you calculate what the population of Ukraine is. No one knows that figure. A lot of them are living in the occupied territories. 5 million have left, and with every day that passes, fewer and fewer of these people will return because they have put down roots outside, right? Ukraine, children are going to schools, having their friends in Germany, Poland. My own 2 kids left at the beginning of the war and are living in Japan, of all places, imagine, and they're fluent Japanese speakers now, and so multiply that by millions. Ukrainians are spread around the world. They've become sort of ambassadors of Ukraine, but what that means for Ukraine's eventual rebuilding is another story. As it's been said, you can win the war but lose the peace, right? this post-war reconstruction. It's been estimated that it could cost up to $1 trillion. Can you imagine? Most people wouldn't even know how many zeros follow that $1 trillion, $1,000 billion. Who is going to pay for that? All these questions remain unanswered. But before we even get to that, it's still too soon to speak. The war is still very much far from over. The destruction continues. Our cities are under constant bombardments by ballistic missiles and drones. Our enemy has ratcheted up its production of drones to the point where it can launch up to 700 drones in one night. That means people cowering, sleeping in subway stations in Kiev, the capital, for up to 10 hours. So that's sleep deprivation, that's once again psychological, psychiatric problems multiplied by millions of people having had to live in this kind of environment for 3.5 years. Constant air raids, constant air sirens, and now there's a greater chance of actually being killed in the city, in a large city such as Kiev, simply because of the number of these attacks. And we've had a situation where we're running out of air defense systems, and America is showing, hesitation as to the continued support of our armed forces.
Do you think they should? Do you think that Ukraine has an unspoken or non-spoken right to demand that there should be a little bit more care from countries like the US, for example, because they've always been non-allied to Russia?
Yeah, and Ukraine was never a member of NATO, so I don't think Ukraine has that right to demand. It's always a very delicate dance, right? You have to be careful not to alienate your allies. And it happened a couple of years ago. The allies started chattering, so to speak, unhappy that Zelensky may come across as a bit too pushy. You always have to. It's a give and take, right? Ukraine's argument has been that if you don't support Ukraine, then the door will come to your doorstep. Russia will continue this aggression. Aggression will spill over your borders. And let's say, imagine Ukraine loses, how many more millions of Ukrainian refugees will spill over Europe's borders? So it's in Europe's interest to continue supporting Ukraine. And when I say Europe, actually, you make that distinction, and that's what Donald Trump has done. Even though I'm not a huge fan of his policies, let's put it on the table, he's been right about one thing. He actually, woke up some Europeans to the fact that it's their war, it's being waged on their continent. They have to bear the lion's share of the expense, right, for this war. So now they're working out a formula whereby America will be selling Ukraine weapons using Europe's money. So that's sort of and when you say that, yes, I mean, what's the argument on the fourth year of this war to a European taxpayer to continue carrying this humongous burden? This costs billions of dollars every month, right? There is an elegant solution to that, and it hasn't been worked out yet. There's no political will for it, but there's $300 billion, you may have heard of, Russian sovereign wealth funds frozen since the beginning of the war in European banks. It's $300 billion. That could actually be paying for all these expenses, but the European powers haven't really decided what to do about that. That would create a potentially negative, precedent for their banking system were they just to confiscate the money. So we're still kind of undecided on that score.
So when you talk about the Ukraine-Russia war, and there is the argument where Russia says the expansion of NATO and the proposal by Ukraine to join NATO is a problem for Russia because it feels its security will be threatened. And one would ask, does Russia have any case when it's having this discussion with regard to Ukraine, a sovereign country, joining NATO and joining the European Union? Do they have any case on that matter?
Well, I mean, whatever the case is, we can go into the specifics of it. What was said back in the 90s between, the European leaders like Helmut Kohl, the former Chancellor of Germany, and Bill Clinton, and before that, George Bush Sr. to the then President of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. You remember that name, right? And Putin claims that there was a solemn promise given to Russia that NATO would not expand to include former Soviet republics. Yes. Well, we don't have it in writing. Let's start with that. We don't. It must have been or may have been a gentleman's agreement. We don't have any proof of that. Then there's a talk that Russia was offered membership in NATO itself, and it didn't go anywhere. And who's at fault? It's kind of murky. So obviously accusations are flying and all these things, and statements that are hard to verify. But be that as it may, Putin has made successful and effective use of this argument that this is a security concern for Russia, even though on the face of it looks a little ridiculous. Russia is the world's greatest nuclear power. And so Ukraine, how is Ukraine an existential threat? Well, if it joins NATO, okay, but who motivated Ukrainians to want to join NATO? This happened after 2014. Let me remind you, that was the first year of Russia's aggression, when the annexation of Crimea and the hostilities, the war breaking out in the east of Ukraine, the Donbass, which is my home area. And so when that happened, that's exactly when majorities of Ukrainians started voicing their desire to join NATO. Before that, it was not an issue, right? And finally, I'll say that if Putin wanted to go into Ukraine to prevent NATO expansion, he has achieved the opposite, because as a result, he got 2 new NATO members because of his hostile actions and the aggression and the scare that has spread around Europe. Finland and Sweden, as you know, for decades, neutral powers, are now members of NATO.
I mean, Peter,
yes,
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and this, what I'm about to say is what actually U.S. President Donald Trump has constantly and repeatedly talked about. But just to quote Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's emphasized that a sustainable peace would then require compromise from Ukraine and also from Russia, so that this then leaves the door open for not just a temporary ceasefire, but as an opening to now talking about lasting peace. What will that look like from Ukraine in terms of compromise? And what will it look like then coming from Russia?
Well, so far, that's the irony of this. And after the summit in Alaska, we still don't see what concessions Putin may have agreed to or not agreed to. We don't have any information on that score, right? They say that the latest we have from Trump's personal envoy, Mr. Witkoff, his real estate buddy, who has nothing to do with diplomacy and does not seem to understand anything about Ukraine. It's just this kind of a slapdash, haphazard diplomacy between Israel and Ukraine, something that would require hundreds of hours and hundreds of professionals, now is being handled by individuals whose experience is in real estate and selling buildings, right, in New York City. Okay, be that as it may, he is now saying that Russia has conceded that it will not invade all of Ukraine, but just, take some of these territories, okay? And we're talking about the industrial hub of Ukraine, like those towns where I grew up, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, that remain under Ukraine's control. So the formula we're seeing is that Ukraine will be swapping Ukrainian land for Ukrainian land. Very unfair, right? But more importantly, Russia will then be in possession of commanding heights. When you talk about the terrain, it will be even more advantageous position. Should it decide to say that, well, Ukraine broke the ceasefire or the peace agreement, we continue to attack. We need an extra miles of the zone sanitaire, right, to control of Ukraine's territory. And so Ukraine's fear is that Russia will continue. It's just a matter of time. Russia will continue rolling over more Ukraine's territory. It always breaks these agreements. It will break another one because our analysis remains unaltered. Putin is obsessed with the idea of controlling all of Ukraine. He does not care about bits and pieces of the territory. He may even stomach the idea of a nominally independent Ukraine, still a member of the UN, its flag, whatever, but de facto he wants control of Kiev. That means a new president. It means Zelensky out. He was someone pliable, someone like Lukashenko next door in Belarus, right, who would be subservient to Moscow, and a firm control of its foreign policy choices, Russian as like I said, as a state language, and downsizing of the army. Like right now, we have about 1 million Ukrainian men and women under arms, right? He wants it down to under 100,000. Imagine, right? A country that would be completely unable to defend itself. So that's what we're talking about.
And speaking of analysis, because you painted that picture, the Wall Street Journal reported that there are 2 scenarios or outcomes out of this conflict. The first one is a situation where you have partition with protection. You spoke about Putin wanting to take apart the industrial part of Ukraine. And the idea is having war lines becoming frozen, with Ukraine then ceding 20% of its territory. The rest of the country then secured via Western-backed defenses and international guarantees, akin to what we then had with the Korean Mystic model. That is one scenario. The second scenario is now partition with subordination. This is where now Ukraine remains nominally intact, but heavily influenced by Russian pressure. Out of these two, what do you think is the likely outcome?
Well, the last one is probably out of the question because Ukraine will not be able to regain under current circumstances all of this territory back, because Putin has already proclaimed, right? He's pushed through his parliament, rubber stamp parliament, the idea that these four currently occupied parts of these oblasts, these regions, are already part of Russia, proper, under the constitution. And so that would be unconstitutional for them to be returning it to Ukraine. I just don't see how it would work. And the first one you mentioned is the 20% of the territory. That could be something might be considered, subject to some future referendum, because acknowledging the EURE, Russia's control over these territories, sets a very bad precedent for the world, right? It breaks with the international norms and standards. De facto is another thing. It may be considered, I don't want to speculate on that, because it's also against Ukrainian law to be considering giving up Ukrainian land. But when you said 20%, that's precisely what I was referring to before. Putin is demanding that Ukraine cede more territory in addition to that 20%. He wants to complete the takeover of these four areas, but parts of them are still under Ukraine's control. So he wants Ukrainians to leave them voluntarily. And those are precisely the areas where the big cities, big towns, and industrial, factories and plants remain. So that's what's happening, and that's considered very unfair. There's opposition to that, and apparently even within the U.S. establishment. I don't think everyone is on board. Far from it. Most Republicans remain supporters of Ukraine, and Democrats. And so Trump is going against the grain of his own party. If you remember, going back to the Cold War era, the biggest hawks were the Republicans, not the Dems. Now, sides have changed. Right now, it's the Democrats who are supposed to be the hawks, but they're completely. They've been immobilized, right, by this onrush of Trump and his MAGA movement. So there's a lot of confusion around this.
Indeed.
And of course, the Europeans are very much against the idea, and that's why they're traveling with Zelensky to the White House as we speak today. There will be travel. It's still very early or like late at night in Europe. I'm confused now because I'm thinking I divide my time between Ukraine,
early morning,
and but in Washington precisely. Washington is still not morning; it's still night. But they will be traveling. Zelensky will be meeting with Trump, and apparently afterwards they will convene in one meeting with Zelensky together with the leaders of France, Germany, and UK.
All right. Peter Zalmayev is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. We're having a conversation and going geopolitical this morning. Global power games. What's being played? We're looking into a crisis that's taking place in Eastern Europe and asking ourselves the questions about the relevance towards Africa. We know that global wars take place. We know that a lot of these wars, a lot of these conflicts, a lot of these frictions that we see is usually power play towards global dominance. We know that. Where does Africa fall in all of this from your point of view?
Well, Africa had a chance to, and it used it, but did not go through with it consistently. But you remember, there's a group of 9 African leaders who went to Moscow and then Kiev the first summer of war of 2022. And there was hope that Africa could make a difference. It's a continent where Russia has had strong positions, where there's a good memory of Russia back when it was the Soviet Union, helping Africans fight apartheid and gain independence. We have to remind that, folks, Ukraine was also part of the Soviet Union. It wasn't just Russia. There was no country called Russia then. It was the Soviet Union, 15 constituent parts. And that's what Zelensky reminded Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, on his visit about, 2-3 months ago, right? You remember, in Pretoria. But it didn't go anywhere. It was just one-off. And my argument has been that, Africa, instead of being the constant recipient of, attentions, right, and aid, etc., could play a more proactive role collectively, for example. Or, for example, look at South Africa as a member of BRICS, it is a founding member of this grouping together with Brazil, Russia, China, India, right? And it's on good speaking terms with both Ukraine and with Russia. Same for Kenya. Kenya has, I think, abstained, right, from condemned the aggression. I think at some point, I think there may have been abstentions when you talk about the UN General Assembly. But Kenya plays a neutral role here, right? It hasn't taken sides necessarily. And when Mr. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, attempted to come to the neighboring country, Tanzania, that's a good example. Tanzania is also neutral. They said no, but then they said no to the visit of our president, right? So, okay, neutrality is good, but then why can't we expect African countries to act more proactively? Why can't they offer themselves as a potential mediator in this? Because look, everyone else has failed. Saudi Arabia has failed. Turkey has failed, and I think that U.S. will be failing. What might happen? I don't want to bet on the likelihood of this or that outcome, but America may just walk away from this and just put it on the shoulders of the Europeans to continue supporting Ukraine, etc. I just don't see this happening anytime soon. So that's been my argument, and conversely, Ukraine has also part of the reason why Africans are not so sure why and what this conflict is about and who to support is because Ukraine has been diplomatically not as active over the last 30 years of independence in Africa. Russia has had the upper hand. It has inherited automatically all the Soviet embassies. It has embassies in 49 countries. But Ukraine has been picking up significantly. It's opened up 10 new embassies in Africa since the war started. Imagine, right? Times of war, and a country opens 10 embassies on the African continent. It's unheard of, right? As the U.S. is considering closing down embassies. There's persistent rumors that Trump is not a lover of Africa. He doesn't care. There may be an unwinding of diplomatic presence here on the continent, and Ukraine is doing the opposite. And
is opening of embassies indicative of the idea that Ukraine then would be a lover of Africa?
Not love, you mean?
Yes.
Not necessarily, but it's a good start, right? Where you have to do some work with people to try to convey your position, right? If you're not present, like for example Burundi. I was in Burundi just a few weeks ago. There's a Russian embassy in Burundi. There's no Ukrainian embassy in Burundi, and there's a very avowedly pro-Russian president of Burundi. Once again, you can argue about how it's natural in a situation where America is disengaging from Africa as far as like the use of soft power. It is, canceled USAID, etc. Of course, it cannot but affect quite negatively America's influence in the conflict. And so, with America's absence from the continent, the positions of countries like Russia will grow. But then the question is, will they be for the benefit? Look at what's happening in Western Africa. Several coups have been happening there, right? Overthrows of legitimate power. Western military bases have had to leave. You talk about Niger, you talk about Central African Republic, Mali. There's a pro-Russian president in Burkina Faso, Traoré, Côte d'Ivoire, etc. So some of these processes are happening, and it's going to be a matter of time to see how it plays out, whether this will play out to these countries' benefit. My position is that it may be just swapping one former colonial master, right, for a neo-colonial master, but we'll just have to see.
Well, Peter,
yes.
you can argue, well, the opening of embassies may signal a start of a relationship and a strategic approach in terms of relations. From Africa, much of it has been to do with, well, beyond just trade, is also an exchange of certain things and all these trade deals. So Africa then finds itself being quoted by the West. We're also being quoted by China, for example, and all these are strategic relationships. Now, the new entrant beyond the US is now Russia, and all these are strategic relationships. Now, how then do you explain a situation where then Ukraine is coming in, it's opening embassies in the continent, and you're looking at what is Russia bringing, what is the US bringing, what is China then bringing, and then now you have this conflict and Africa needs to take a position. How can African states then avoid becoming pawns in a new Cold War?
You're absolutely right. Ukraine has instituted this program, Grain from Ukraine. And Kenya, I think, may have been a recipient of free grain from Ukraine for some time. And then also Mozambique, Malawi, and Zambia. They are participants in that. But you cannot compare the level of engagement and abilities capabilities, right, of someone like China that builds high-speed railways in these countries, right? I was just in Tanzania. They're extending the Dar es Salaam, Dodoma line to Burundi and Arusha. It's incredible what's happening. Ukraine is just not in that league of countries. So our appeal has been to the idea of upholding international law, how that Ukraine's failure to defend its sovereignty will lead to a really bad precedent, right, around the world, especially on the African continent, where, as you know, a lot of the countries, the borders of these countries were arbitrarily drawn by former colonial powers who didn't care about tribal identities, languages. They just looked, maybe in a drunken state sometimes, and just drew these borders arbitrarily. So that's sort of the overarching argument, that we need to protect the sanctity of this law. That means voting your conscience at the level of the United Nations General Assembly. But then who am I to say, or anyone to say, who African countries should or should not be partners with? When I was in Namibia, it had just signed a nuclear power agreement with Russia. And, we just look at it as a sovereign country's sovereign decision. So basically, it has to be of necessity, not anything concrete, in answer to your question, a more of an abstract overarching answer that Africans should, treasure their support, meaning like they have to understand the worth of their support and not have anyone take their support for granted.
Right.
Right? You can maintain a smart neutral stand, if you will. You can continue voting your conscience at the UN, and then you can still engage with these countries. Look at the example of Rwanda. Some say a one-party's rule, and a very hard rule by one man who's been in power for since 1994, over 30 years. And yet Rwanda, being on very good relations with Russia, has still voted to condemn the aggression at the United Nations.
So we look at a situation where through the Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine has gone into opening new embassies in Africa, and one would argue this is because now Ukraine sees the need of the African support as opposed to before, when Africa did not matter. And an African would say, why should we matter now that you are in war? That's question number one. Number two, if we look at this war that is happening right now, there is the forays that have been made by US President Donald Trump, but we will not forget what happened at White House during that meeting with Zelensky. And even now that Zelensky is going back to White House, what exactly are we looking into achieving from that, if anything would really come out of it?
To answer your first question, you absolutely agree. It's a matter of empathy. The further you remove from this conflict, and the different color of your skin dictate this lack of corresponding lack of empathy. Like I say to my compatriots, I have a TV show in Ukraine. You expect the support of Africans kind of almost for granted, but then which one of you cared or knew about the Rwandan genocide? When it was happening? How many of you know when it happened, right? Do you know that there's probably more people dying in Sudan now than even in Ukraine, right? Who really cares about that, right? So this is a lot of you have to work with the people to understand that, before they expect, they have to also show some, corresponding concern and care. My hope is only that this grain from Ukraine, it's not just that. And of course, there's an element of it. Why have they been opened? Precisely because Ukraine wants African support. Let's not beat around the bush. I hope that this stays without the war, after the war, the grain program stays, relations develop. So it's not just a one-off. And the second question about, I was traveling, I was already in Africa when this meeting happened. I called it, as the SH, a shit show. Is that okay to use it on your show?
Well, it's a bit late now, but okay.
Sorry. I have no. I mean, I'm at a loss for words to describe that meeting. And then Ramaphosa showed up. There was another. That was part 2, right?
Yeah.
Beat up session at the White House. That scored a lot of sympathy points for Zelensky in Africa. People said, you just don't treat guests like that. I guess North Americans have lost that respect of guests, which still remains in more traditional cultures like Asia and Africa, right, or Ukraine. But be that it happened, what happened, yes, and that's why I think Trump wants to meet with Zelensky first, one-on-one. He thinks that he can just sort of press him or pressure him into these concessions. He is a believer in that, might makes right, and Ukraine is not in the same league with Russia and America. And remember, he proclaimed Russia power number 2 after America just the other day. I think China and India would have an issue with that, right? But he's exhibiting these, hallmarks of a old school leader who does not really believe in institutions and, the power of the smaller countries, etc. So I'm very, very concerned about this meeting coming up and what peace will be attempted to be imposed on us.
Sure. There's a theory in international relations called game theory, which is that when you look at the relations between nations, it is clear that everybody is operating and acting in their own strategic manner. That when you look at the nations that quote unquote rule the world, that you will have certain nations doing certain things within their own interest in a strategic way for a planned outcome. And we today are seeing a more salient conflict that is playing out on the African continent. That world powers, though not in exact armed conflict, are still scavenging for global power, but they're looking for support from the African continent. A similar thing has happened previously. We see the same thing playing out again in 2025. And so questions will be asked around what difference is being made now. And I would say the difference is that Africa's eyes are open and aware of the fact that conflicts that are being played out in other parts of the world are being represented and living out on the African continent. And so previously, Africa's opinion was never requested about what people wanted to do. So why today would Africa say, well, okay, I'm going to throw my support behind one or two nations? Because it's not about feelings, Andrew. It's not about emotions. It's about what nations are trying to achieve. And would they have requested the knowledge or attention of Africa if it didn't suit their own personal interest?
That's true.
So is there anything beyond personal interest here? So when everybody wants to court Africa again, it's not really about for the development or betterment of the continent. It's again going back to strategic game theory about their personal interest. Should we see beyond that?
You're absolutely right, and what we're seeing actually this play for the hearts and minds of Africans, etc. You can look at it cynically. Once again, I have to make that appeal to the international law that it will have long-lasting consequences if we live in this dog-eat-dog world, right? With might makes right. This is a larger argument that may not have that immediacy to a lot of people, right? And also in the absence, once again, of a much more present U.S. on the continent, right? If it's disengaging as a upholder of liberal democratic norms, right? Because that's a good question. I don't think
is America really the vanguard of democratic
not anymore.
in Africa?
Not anymore, and not under this president who has actually said. Remember, I said I don't mind being a dictator for one day. He said, but I think he's showing much more lasting, tendencies to be a dictator. Right? I don't want to be hyping it up, but the discourse in America, about how Donald Trump is waging war on our institutions. So there's, as a Ukrainian American, I'm both. I'm an American as well. I can comment on that. And I met Donald Trump in 2006, riding the elevator with him for a few minutes. So I even have this idea of the man and the measure of the man. The fact that they elected it in 2016, this man, but is one thing. But that they re-elected him after everything we knew about him, that says something about America and where it's going. The world is kind of adrift. And yes, there will be African countries drifting this way or that way. I just hope that some people are able to see these things for what they are. And in fact, I'm discovering way more sanity right now, politically speaking, on the African continent than I'm seeing either in my part of the world or in America or in Western democracies. Soon we'll be in a situation where Africa will be, the roles will be reversed, and Africa will be preaching sanity in politics, bipartisanship, all these things. So far Africa has been able to avoid the worst scourges of populism that we've seen in Europe. I know it's a very roundabout way of saying things. Ultimately you're absolutely right. It's hard to make an argument why it should support this country or that, or should care about this war or not. For me, it's an educational role that I'm playing, just to lay the cards on the table, why some arguments don't hold water, why some do, and let the people decide where their sympathies lie.
Does Ukraine have any might? Because we're looking at, again, two sides of a war. It's not a conflict. It's not friction. It's a war that's currently going on. But it would appear as though and of course you've talked about the fact that Russia being a world power, a world nuclear power, the greatest in the world, nuclear-wise, and then also with the likes of Putin as president. Is Ukraine powerless?
Well, listen, Putin went into Ukraine, remember, when it happened, February 24th, 2022, as he was making that announcement, bombs started falling right there. I woke up with the bombs as Putin was speaking. I remember that moment, the worst day of my life, the scariest day of my life. He expected to march into Kiev within 3 to 7 business days. 3.5 years later, we're still here. Yes, you can say we would not have been able to do it without Western support, for sure. But still, it's not, these bombs don't shoot themselves. These, HIMARS missiles don't launch themselves, right? And these, you have to have manpower. This country has been resisting this invasion. I don't think any European country in Ukraine's position would have been able to do the same, And there's actually statistics to back it up. The Bundeswehr, the German army, would have lasted not more than a week against the Russian army. Ukrainians took on the worst, the biggest nuclear colossus, and it's still there, 3.5 years, right? So Ukraine now has, with everything that's happening still, Russia, of course, outmatches it with resources, with manpower, etc., with its allies. Europeans are not ready to step in with boots on the ground. Look at Russia's allies, North Korea, and they've sent 15,000 troops, right?
So Ukraine is not powerless.
But Ukraine has still Europe's largest army. If Russia apart, Ukraine has the best army, the most battle-hardened army of Europe. So the question now is, if Ukraine were to fall, imagine that sort of resource would automatically become Russia's. And Russia would become a predominant power and would then stand to threaten the European continent. So it's for Europeans to decide whether they want Ukraine's army on their side or whether the Ukrainian army eventually will be recruited, will be either run into exile, some of them will be killed, sent to the Gulag in Siberia, but a lot of the Ukrainians will then be fighting for Russia. That is, and my argument has been this will be the end, the sort of the siren song of Europe as a continent, as an idea, as a liberal democratic idea. Those stars you see on against the background of deep blue will be no more. It'll just remain on paper. Europe will disappear. The idea of the West will disappear. Should Ukraine fall, those are the stakes in this conflict, in my opinion.
When you talk about Africa's participation in this war, pretty much, and its position, Africa has for a very long time held a position of indifference when it comes to this war. And when you talk about that and how Africa is viewed pretty much across the globe, you look at a continent that has no space or even position in the Security Council. Kenya's position as a NATO ally is now being thrown out of the door because of its decision to work together with China, to be friends with China. And if you look at where Africa sits and its position, especially on this war, what would you want to see Africa say? Its position on Africa, on the Russia-Ukraine war?
I think policy of neutrality and at least a rhetorical condemnation of this aggression, while still pursuing your economic interests with these countries, is probably the most, we think the least, but also probably the most we can expect and should expect, right? Or should, I want to stay away from the should part, the could part, okay. But you are right, you hit the nail on its head when it comes to the international law and the closest we have to the world government, and that's the Security Council of the United Nations, the executive body, right? It remains an anachronism of this post-World War order that the permanent five remain, continue to have this veto power of its decisions, right? And some of them are not very representative of the demography. Look at, Christ, Kenya's population is probably soon will overtake Britain. But look at Nigeria. Nigeria is probably the population of Nigeria is more than several of these permanent five, France and UK combined, right? Why is it not on the table? It's an anachronism, right? So that means the UN is also losing its legitimacy very, very, very quickly, right? So African countries should have a seat at the table. Otherwise, once again,
or build their own table,
or as it happened to the League of Nations, UN will be obsolete whether through this kind of unrepresentative setup or I think Donald Trump's eventual decision, I think it's coming to that, to stop financing and just to maybe even leave the United Nations. I think we're approaching that moment soon.
Mm-mm. Okay. What does it look like in the coming days from what you see? I mean, there's a meeting taking place today in a few hours. Are we looking at ceasefire in the horizon?
Well, that's precisely the thing. Ukraine expected a ceasefire, but I think that after the talk between Putin and Trump is now talking about a full peace agreement. That's a trap we're working into. That's actually Putin's wish, and that presupposes all these conditions that I just mentioned, kind of capitulatory, right? So, in the absence of a peace agreement, it seems like Putin has been given carte blanche to continue bombing Ukraine, whilst there's some kind of eventual and large peace agreement that we're still far from formulating. Very many unknowns in this process. We'll be, holding our breath for today. I'll just leave you with that, a little tidbit that's a bit optimistic, more optimistic than anything I said so far, that they actually may have worked out some security arrangement for Ukraine, short of NATO membership, that could guarantee Ukraine's security eventually in whatever, formula they find. So I'm holding my breath.
Let's see. Peter Zalmayev is the director of Eurasia Democracy Initiative, has been our guest this hour, looking into the intrigues of this global wars and Africa's strategic place in all of this between Ukraine and Russia. Thank you so much for being here this morning, Peter. Looking forward to
was a pleasure.
more conversations. Asante Sana. Good morning.
This is The Situation Room, the only way to start your day.